Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ed.
And I'm John.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us for this episode of Common Sense. If you haven't joined us for a previous episode, Common Sense is John's and my take on just straightforward, unvarnished ideas on what's happening in business these days. And the name comes from the affinity that we both have for history and Thomas Paine's pamphlet and ideas of the Revolutionary era, all about just straightforward, simple assessment of situations, and as he says, common sense. So hopefully you'll find some of that here with us today.
Yeah, and while we're on the point of revolution, we're for the next several sessions, really probably the next 10 or so, we're going to be talking about winning the complex sale in the age of disruption. So disruption is the modern era's way of saying revolution. So we're going to start with that topic, and then we'll move on to quite a few others that have to do with the same general topic. So let's start there, Ed. What do you think about disruption these days? What does it mean, and how is it impacting American business?
So that's a big question, obviously. I think it's easy to get off track treating disruption as some sort of a big abstract theory. The reality is business is about individual transactions between sellers and buyers. And if the essence of business is transaction, then the question about disruption comes in what's the context? How is it affecting those transactions? It's important to recognize that technology doesn't change business. Technology enables different buyer behaviors and different expectations, but it's those buyer behaviors and expectations that really change the business, not technology. And so disruption isn't a technology story either. And if you look at recent history and use an example of manufacturers in the late 80s and early 90s in the US, what we see is that sometimes the change is hard to see. Manufacturers were suddenly disrupted by import competition, and they got very serious about improving their manufacturing. The problem is, while they improved manufacturing and did a great job becoming efficient and rejuvenating US manufacturing, at the same time, they never addressed the root cause. The root cause was that buyers had different expectations, and understanding what buyers expect is really the key to navigating disruption. You work with a lot of middle market companies. Based on your experience, how pervasive is it? We talk about it, but is disruption as pervasive as we think it is?
Well, just going back to your analogy of the 80s and innovations that have gone on in American manufacturing, we've got those same kinds of innovations going on today. If you think about it, there's 3D printing, there's Internet of Things, there's AI, there's all kinds of robotics going on, and e-commerce. Everything is available online these days. So while these things don't drive every single change in every industry, they are affecting every industry to some extent. And there's new ways that buyers expect to engage with businesses. So if you think about blockchain, or you think about the shared economy, things that hearken to using Uber, for example, to get a ride somewhere. Those are things that are impacting nearly every industry, from manufacturing to healthcare to transportation to retail, across the board. So it's really quite pervasive. So what do you think? Are there any industries that are ahead, or they're doing better than others? What's your take on how this is coming to the fore?
So if the essence of business is transactions, obviously the companies and the people doing those transactions are really the answer to that question. It's hard to generalize sometimes by industries. Companies have a character. That being said, some industries have been born during this period that we see of disruption. I mean, SaaS, software as a service, for instance, is an industry that's really come from this disruptive period. And so because they've been born in this disruption, they're faring better. On the other hand, there are companies that are very, very firmly entrenched in very traditional models of buying stuff, manipulating in a factory, making it, shipping it out the door, selling it through sales channel, standard relationships with sales channel and buyers. And those companies, those kind of conservative, traditional companies in those conservative and traditional industries, I would say are probably having the hardest time navigating the disruption that we're seeing. But again, coming back to this idea that it's not about necessarily big themes. I mean, we love the themes and they guide the conversation, but a CEO driving to work every day has certain specific issues they need to be thinking about. What would you list as those issues that CEOs need to worry about, John?
Well, I think number one is the one we've just been talking about, and that is, what is the role of your company and buyers? What's the relationship between buyers and your company? Is it the same old sort of sales process where we're pushing products out and hoping they buy? I don't think so. I think it's changed a lot, and how companies adapt to that, how they change, how they incorporate a new kind of mindset. Those are things that CEOs really need to worry about, because it's not a simple change. You can't just pull some technology in and push a button. And then the next thing is really, what is the mindset of your employees? How do you get everybody on board, sort of championing the consumer, the customer, and making them happy, making customer service part of the overall benefit, not just selling them products. And then last but not least, and of course there's plenty more, the role of data. How are we collecting data from our customers, from our outside influences? What are we doing with that data? How are we utilizing it to improve revenue growth? So that's kind of another one we'll talk about in some depth later. But I think one of the things that's frustrating to me is that CEOs that I talk to, maybe they are taking into account one or two of these, but not all of them. So what do you think, is getting in the way of that, and what could they be doing better?
So I think the nature of American business is that it very much focuses on process and efficiency. And if you build your framework around process and efficiency, and I'm not saying that's bad, I'm just saying it's reality, what that does is it leads to a very kind of a linear mindset. Here's how we've done it. Now let's sit down as a group. Let's figure out where the waste is. Let's make it more efficient. And then you come out with a more efficient version of what you've traditionally done in the past. And that mindset, if you will, where you always kind of look at everything as an incremental step change from the previous version, makes it really hard to embrace some of the challenges inherent in this disruption that we're talking about. And further, not only is that kind of the way the company and industry and business in general handles it, but many of these executives have grown up in these companies. They've spent, in many cases, entire careers. Many are privately held or family-owned businesses, and it's just the way it's always been done, right? So to really have a complete shift of what you see as the business and the revenue models, and how you incorporate data and how you monetize it and how you incorporate blockchain, the kinds of things you've been talking about, that's really, really, really hard. Plus, there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, it's easy if you say, we need to evaluate the credit of each of our customers in a certain way. You can build that process. You can even get credit insurance. You can have a very specific, clearly delineated process. If you say, how is blockchain going to change our business in 5 years? Or how are all the B2C trends and consumer expectations going to change the way B2B does business? It's very hard to anticipate. So that uncertainty means that if you've got a certain amount of energy to worry about things, and that's just so remote, in many cases, companies spend, or CEOs spend, less time thinking about that. But of course, there's two costs to failing to consider that. There's an opportunity cost. What could you be doing if you were thinking about it? And there's the actual cost of how is a business going to be negatively impacted if you don't. Talk about those costs.
Well, there's really a couple of major ones that everybody runs into, and I hear from CEOs all the time that they complain that their competitors are beating them up online. They're doing better online and they're getting all the new leads because they're utilizing modern digital sales and marketing technology and techniques to get the best leads, the ones that are actually searching for their services. So competitive disadvantage is a big one. If you're not taking advantage of the new, not just technologies, but new ideas and innovation, and really changing the mindset like we've been talking about, you're going to fall behind your competitors who are doing that. So that's the most obvious. But then I think a lot of companies are starting to notice that revenues are not necessarily tanking, but they're slowing down. So the growth in revenue is slowing down. And that's really related to this lack of innovation, this lack of embracing change. So that's another one that's really important. And then if that's happening, investors are not happy, right? So, there's investor unrest going on because stocks aren't growing, revenues aren't growing, so people aren't meeting their expectations and not leading in their market. So what are some examples of that in your experience where people have run into these problems and not adjusted fast enough?
So I love the story. If you've read Machine Platform Crowd, I love the story that talks about the trend of electrification. Up in the Northeast where I am, we had all these mills, and they're all built along rivers because the hydraulic power drove the mills. So they were capturing the hydraulic power from the river. They had these leather belts that transmitted it up through the floors and down along the floors. And it was an operation that made sense. And then somebody came up with electricity. And we all think of electricity as having dramatically changed manufacturing, except when you read the example in Machine Platform Crowd, you realize that the first electrification of factories was to take this giant electric motor and put it in the basement and do exactly the same thing that the water was doing with these leather belts transmitting the power up between the floors and down along the floors to each machine. The real change wasn't electricity. The real change was putting an individual smaller motor on every machine. And then you distributed power and you completely changed manufacturing at that point. I think that's a great analogy for some of what we face now as companies see all this change around them. But how do you pick out what's really relevant? How do you sort out the change that you need to worry about, to address, to speak to adapt to, from change that's just kind of cooking along in the background? A great current example, I think, is the role of sales channel. Everyone assumed that you had manufacturers, distributors, and reps, and then everyone assumed that with the internet, you're only going to have manufacturers. But now it's clearly shaking out in a different kind of a way, where the group that can provide value to the buyers, that understands the buyers and gives them the user experience, the customer experience that they want, is the one that's winning, regardless of where they are in that traditional value chain of distribution. And of course, you start to think about the FANGs, if you will, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, and the impact that those have on how each of us lives our lives and does our business. And there's really a very strong bleed through, if you will, or blurring of the difference between B2C and B2B. And so I think one of the places the CEOs need to be looking and thinking is how the consumer experience is increasingly dictating what our buyer experience will be on the B2B side. So those are kind of categories, but how about specific success stories? What are you seeing in that area, John?
Well, you mentioned four of them. The FANG companies, everybody knows, are basically grabbing everything they can find. They're becoming huge monopolies across all kinds of different industries. So the CEOs of those companies have a vision, and they're exploiting it to the max right now. It's just a question of whether or not they'll get reined in by government at this point, which is unlikely. So those are some obvious examples. And then in more specific cases, you think about Uber, which is really sort of cornered the ride-sharing market. Just a one brilliant idea, and they have exploited it, across multiple countries now. So they're doing super well. But if you think about other industries, like renewable energy is growing very, very fast, not just here, but also overseas even more. So a few years ago, we probably would have thought, they'll never compete with oil and gas, and now they're just, within a few years, there probably won't be a lot of energy produced from oil and gas. So that's great. It's great for the world. It's great for most economies. So that's an example of innovation really kind of aligned with what people want for the planet. And then healthcare is another one. It's that even now we're all scared to death that healthcare isn't going to be there for us when we get older, but it's changing really fast. So the whole concept of one-on-one medical care, where you're talking to the doctor online and getting, kind of pay as you go innovations and drugs and things like that you need through mail order, through Amazon, wherever it might be. It's amazing how fast things are changing there too. So there really aren't any, as we mentioned earlier, there really aren't any industries that won't be changed dramatically in the next few years. And the change is accelerating. I think everybody knows that. So what do you think the impact will be, though, if people just fail to get on board with this trend? What globally and nationally, where do you think we'll be if companies don't, get with it, get with the program?
So I'll answer that in two ways. I'll answer it my gut feeling and my personal experience. I see companies now experiencing distended sales pipelines. The sales cycle is unpredictable. They're losing to the status quo more often. So sales are kind of slowing, not in an acute and an emergency way, but as you described, it's changing. I'll answer it another way, though, and that's to take from Forrester Research. They just released a great report, Predictions 2018. And some of what it says is, and I'll just read part of this, unmet customer expectations are resulting in churn. The lack of digital transformation gains is translating into loss of market share. Industry lines have protected some are crumbling, and long-standing durable business models are failing. And it goes on to say, those declines will translate into a net loss of a point of growth. And 1/5 of the CEOs will fail to act to bring about the necessary digital transformation. It's hard to articulate it any better than that excerpt from that report. This isn't about single companies that aren't getting it. This is about broad swaths of many industries that have failed to just kind of embrace the opportunity because of the overwhelming challenge that it feels like to really try to understand the disruption that's going on. On the other hand, the North Star for every company is really easy. It's the buyers. It's what buyers expect, what buyers are articulating they need, what buyers are demonstrating they need even when they aren't articulating it. So you can strip away all the technology and all the other stuff, and the good news is for companies, if you understand what the buyers want, how to provide the value they're looking for, then that's the key. But CEOs have all these things that they're juggling, and this covers a number of different disciplines within a company and relationship with the board and relationship with outside advisors. So let's just give a quick preview of what we're going to be talking about through this series of videos, John.
Well, we're going to start with your first one, and that's, how to meet buyer expectations. What's changed in the past few years? How do people actually go about buying from companies? And we call that the new buyer journey. So we're going to go through that in some detail, and then we're going to talk about what to do about it through a series of topics related to what's the new sales? What's that about? And how does that relate to marketing? How does that relate to customer service? What do you need to do in terms of technology and training and change management to bring your company on board and to put these things in place effectively? So we're going to be going piece by piece through this roadmap and helping you understand not only what it's about, but kind of how we recommend going about making those changes. And we're going to do this in a series of videos like this one, but then at the end of the day, we're going to put all this together in a book so you have one place to go where you can find all this roadmap and information. And I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to be fun for us and also very helpful for you.
Absolutely. And we'd love everyone watching to ultimately join us and buy the book. But along the way, you're going to be able to follow this journey through each of these video segments. And you can do that by following Common Sense on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Facebook. And in conjunction with this video, you'll see the links to be able to subscribe in all those places and keep up with each of these chapters as we go along talking about them. So it's been a pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Common Sense. I'm Ed.
And I'm John.